right. Well, thanks everybody for tuning in. Today we're going to have a hopefully very interesting conversation about Dr. Jordan Peterson, who I expect many of you are familiar with. And if you're not, we're going to try and elaborate on who he is and what he is contributing to the contemporary conversation around philosophy and psychology and what it is that afflicts us and some of the solutions to our deepest questions and our deepest problems. So with me, I have as a guest, Father Hugh Mackenzie. Father Hugh, welcome and thanks for joining me.
Thank you very much for having me on.
Yeah. So do you mind just introducing yourself a little bit? Tell us who you are, where you are, some of the work that you're involved in.
I'm a Roman Catholic priest in Westminster Cathedral in London. I've been a priest for 28 years. I am also a hospice chaplain at our Catholic hospice here in London, doing some study as well.
Okay, great. What has been your interest in Peterson? When did you first get introduced to him, and why do you find him to be a compelling figure in today's contemporary conversation?
Well, I've been interested in the intellectual side of evangelization and in trying to diagnose why our culture really as a whole has been moving away from Christianity. And in doing that, I've been interested, I think, in someone like John Paul II, who I think recognized that this turn to the subject, it's sometimes called, that Immanuel Kant inaugurated in the 19th century, has been partly responsible for a culture in which individual feelings are more important, and people emphasize and claim the validity of their personal experience. And I've always thought, well, that there's something in that maybe the church should be, as I think John Paul II was trying through, for instance, what is called his phenomenological approach. That the church, that's a good thing to try and tune into and see if it can help us in re-evangelizing modern culture, particularly if it is related to the diagnosis of what has, to use a negative word, I think is valid, gone wrong. So when I saw Jordan Peterson making a significant impact upon people, and when I saw the comments that are so often below his videos, where people say, this has really affected me, this has affirmed me in a deep way, this is making me ask deeper questions, this is making me think about goodness and badness in a new way, in a different way, this is making me move away from some of the relativistic and purely subjective emphases within our culture, I certainly became interested in him, and I felt that at least as a starting point, or at least in terms of what I understood to be where he's coming from, he is quite well tuning into this turn to the human experience that has been going on in our culture. He himself does even use the same school of thought, phenomenology. And so I became very interested in what he was doing, but then also I obviously saw that his conclusions are different from mine as a Catholic priest.
Yeah, maybe one thing we should say up front too is that we don't claim to speak for Jordan Peterson. We're not experts in his thought necessarily, and we may get some things wrong here, and we're open to that correction too. What we're trying to do through the course of this conversation is to interpret what he has written and what he has said. You're far more fluent and familiar with some of that than I am, which is why I'm looking forward to hearing your insights on that. But it's an interpretation, and so there might be things where if he was able to participate in this conversation, he might correct us on some of those things. And we're kind of open to that correction. But obviously, Peterson is a very influential figure and someone who has generated a lot of interest in his thought. And you may have heard this as well, but I've certainly heard from many people, even converts, more recent converts, that Jordan Peterson was sort of the gateway drug to theism for them, or to taking Scripture and maybe the Christian community, if not its thought and revelation, more seriously. And so I think it's important for us to have a more complete and nuanced understanding of where Peterson seems to get things really right, where he maybe misses the mark, or where he departs company with the Christian tradition, and how it is that we can maybe partner with the Jordan Petersons of the world, because in this age we're living in it's so sectarian and so full of factions that I'm at the point, and this is even true within the church. Obviously, there are so many different groups. There are conservatives and liberals, and these sort of labels that we will identify groups within the church by, and people will embrace those identities. That you have to find reasons to work together rather than to divide. I'm at the point now where I think that if I can find people of goodwill and people of sincere faith, those are people I'm willing to try and work with and to collaborate with to whatever degree we can advance the church's interest and the proclamation of the kingdom. And it seems to me that Peterson is a person of goodwill, even though we may disagree on certain things. But for those of us that are invested in our faith and invested in what it means to be a Catholic and a disciple of Jesus Christ, I think it is important for those people to understand the distinctions between Peterson's thought and Catholic thought.
Yeah. And so I think you're right. He clearly has created something of a coalition of people from many different traditions. And I think that itself is interesting and maybe helpful in healing some of our traditions. And whatever you think maybe of some of his politics, his starting point, as I've touched on already, of seeing the human person as someone who gets up in the morning, has to decide whether to brush his teeth or not, and should, that moral word comes into Jordan Peterson quite a lot, should try, if he wants to be sane, says Peterson, if I'm hearing him correctly, should try to make the world a better place. And that's going to bring people of goodwill together. He believes that human beings have a will, and he articulates that quite well, that we have this creative freedom. That's partly come out of some of his philosophies, such as the phenomenological and existentialism. And so he believes we're responsible individuals. And linked with that, he affirms objective morality, good and bad, that it's not purely made up by us. So I think as Catholics, all of those things that I've just mentioned should interest us. And the fact that he's drawing people together from many different traditions and people who have been a bit lost in our modern culture as well, of finding hope and affirmation of some very deep intuitions in the human spirit that I do exist. There is a bigger world out there than me, and there's right and wrong as well. And he's awoken that and encouraged a lot of people. So I think that's the very good side of Peterson and is in tune with our Catholic faith.
Yeah. Hey, just a quick thank you to the sponsor of this video, which is the Saint Maker. It's, as many of you know, very well established in our tradition, as well as the classical tradition, that you don't grow in virtue by accident. It has to be deliberate, and it can't just be the vague sort of deliberate, like, oh, I need to grow in temperance. It has to be specific resolutions and specific goals that you identify. And so the Saint Maker is this planner and this tool that helps you to make those kinds of specific resolutions and then to stay committed to them and to measure as you go. It's a planner, it's a calendar, it's a devotional book. It includes the liturgical calendar, both the old and the new. So if you are stuck, or if you really want to take your cultivation of virtue to the next level, then the Saint Maker is the kind of tool that will help you do that. You can get yours at thesaintmaker.com. And if you use the promo code Brian Holdsworth, they'll give you 10% off. I think it would be helpful to describe how Peterson came into the spotlight to some degree. So obviously there were some controversies here in Canada at the university that he worked at that were more of a political nature, and that created headlines. But then not long after that, he did a lecture series on Scripture that he had posted on, I believe, just on YouTube, which generated a lot of interest. And something I've heard from people, especially Christians and Catholics, was that it was that lecture series specifically that inspired them to take their faith more seriously. And I think that there's a lot that we as a church can learn from this kind of thing. One of there's a phenomenon within the church where as people progress into adulthood, we often lose them at that point. When they go from, let's say, high school aged to university aged, it's not uncommon for them to drift away from their practice of the faith and the church. And I think there's a lot of reasons that we could identify why that might happen, but one that seems fairly obvious to me is that in their upbringing, they are introduced to a faith that isn't very sophisticated. It's very juvenile, obviously, and that's appropriate given the ages. But at a certain point, as they progress into adulthood, it needs to become more sophisticated. These things that we believe, and there is a sophisticated account for it. But I think we as a church don't do a very good job of introducing it at an appropriate time, or making sure that there's a scaffolding of formation at those phases of life as they go into young adulthood. And what often commonly happens is that they will go off to university and they will be introduced to other views that are contrary to the Catholic view that are sophisticated. And that captures their sense of wonder and intellectual curiosity. And at that point, we've probably lost them. But I think what Peterson has done with that lecture series, and what he's continued to do through his writing and publishing and speaking, is introduced many people, many Christians, to a sophisticated treatment, right or wrong, but it is sophisticated, of Scripture and Revelation. And they are now saying, wow, this is so interesting, and it's actually intellectual. It's not the juvenile thing that I was introduced to through kids' books as a child.
Yeah, and it's intellectual from the point of view of a psychologist. He's not a trained philosopher. He doesn't claim to be, although he is very well read, and he certainly uses modern post-Kantian philosophy. But he particularly uses psychology, and he's read it all, and he has the studies, and he's interpreting Genesis, I think, through that lens, showing how there's deep things in these ancient stories that speak to the human spirit and speak to our joys, but particularly speak to our fears, and have something to say about coming out of that. So I think that is the key reason why he's doing well, and why maybe we're not, because I think a lot of our thought, whilst there's great wisdom and has built a fantastic civilization in many ways, does need, I think, to be fine-tuned a little bit to take account a little bit more of the human individual and subjective experience. We're not ever going to be individualists, but hopefully, but we're always communitarian, and we believe in family in the Catholic Church. But it is, I think, important, maybe, if sometimes our traditional teaching sounds as if we have a series of truths here that are clearly set and are definitely right, which I do believe, but as if they are just purely things that people have to fit into. Right. Here's the template you just fit into, and your personal experience is ultimately irrelevant. I mean, we'll be compassionate, we'll listen to you, we'll walk with you, but either you fit in, or you're not of values, and your feelings are not of value. And I think in many ways have always taken account of people's feelings, and I think we're growing more in doing that. But I think Peterson does it in an intellectual way, that he is saying that the very concept of truth matches very beautifully the way we're made as a human subject, as someone who's yearning for the hero figure, for instance, or yearning to be growing in communion with others, to engage in the dance, he calls it sometimes, with the world that we seem to be made for. So I think that's something maybe the church does need to sort of say, we're obviously not going to give up on revelation, but as the psalmist says, truth is for the heart. And I think Peterson might be enabling us to connect that modern contemporary yearning, insight, which is driven by some quite deep philosophy to some degree, and Christian revelation. And I think, as I say, I think John Paul II was trying to explore that in some of his documents.
Yeah, yeah. Peterson seems to have a really strong reverence for myth and storytelling, which is a great point to have conversations, right? Because it is something that is part of all of our shared heritage. We can all learn something from these stories, whether we take them as historical fact or as mere myth or as mere stories, that from which there is an ethical, moral that we can extract from that or not. Do you think that he goes too far in the sort of the subjective treatment of stories?
Yes, absolutely. And I think that's the reason he can't get to God. I mean, so one of the ways in which he goes too far is he doesn't believe in God, I suppose. Because, I think that I obviously believe in God, and we in the Catholic tradition we believe that we can rationally show that God exists. So we should expect these deep truths about the human person to cohere with our belief in a transcendent God. So yes, I think he seems to me to be really affirming a sort of animism that fundamentally we are just sort of monist beings. Matter, spirit is not a clear distinction for him, as it is in our tradition. And he perhaps even is moving towards some sort of panpsychism, or sometimes even a pantheism, that everything is conscious, or everything out there is purely dependent upon the human creative consciousness. And that there is a strong thrust in that direction within, for instance, existentialist philosophy. But that is a sort of point at which we should have alarm bells, I think, as Catholics. And we should therefore be saying, let's tread carefully, but as you said, he's a man of goodwill and he's made some very good points and he's connecting. So can we maybe humbly and explore some possible fine-tuning of some of his approaches to allow it to move in the direction of classical theism?
Okay. Well, that's interesting too, because I imagine there are quite a few people watching this who appreciate Peterson's approach and his thought, and especially those who say things like, he's the reason I came into the church, who would be surprised to hear you say something like he doesn't believe in God. Certainly in his lectures and in his book, he talks about God as if God exists and as if we interact with God. I mean, he may have a different conception. It may not be the Trinitarian God. But why do you say that he doesn't believe in God?
Well, I think he's touched on it himself in that when he's asked that question, he sort of takes a deep breath and gives answers that are in tune with a lot of his insights, but can't affirm a transcendent personal God. He will affirm transcendent absolute goodness, but he would rather say things like, well, I'm a pragmatic man. And again, that's woven very well into his thinking, I think, that human beings are beings who are aware of a world which enables them to engage with it, hopefully morally. So there's a bit of what is sometimes called, with a capital P, pragmatism in his thoughts. So he says, I'm a practical man. He says, if I really believed in God, I think I heard him say once, I would act as if God exists, and I'm not sure I do. And then I've also heard him say the opposite, actually, which is that, well, he says, I sort of act as if God exists. I have heard him say that, so that might be taken more as saying that he's a theist. But his arguments are very much that being is consciousness, consciousness is being. He's said that. He emphasizes constantly that the world in which we live is rooted in human creativity. One of the examples he uses he said, look at chairs. He says, well, a chair is rooted in human creativity and consciousness, and the definition of it is a sort of pragmatic function that we've created. He says, look at a tree stump. A tree stump can be made into a chair purely by a human mind. So the human mind is there, it's in there. He's even, with a very interesting discussion he had with two professors from the Word on Fire Institute, where they seem to be at cross purposes quite a lot, because they were coming from the more scholastic, he's coming from the more phenomenological, and they didn't quite, I felt, understand that. But they had an interesting encounter where they were sort of saying, the two professors were saying, you know, did dinosaurs exist completely independently of the human consciousness? And he gave an interesting, and I'm answer that was sort of, well, dinosaurs as we understand them are intrinsically related to the human knower. So there's a lot of his thought that is tending towards, if not pantheism, certainly what I'd call a sort of panpsychism, that really human consciousness is capturing an intrinsic dynamic of what the world in which we live is, and for him is not just capturing that, but creating it almost sometimes and without it, it would just be I think with those two professors, he said it would just be pure matter energy. So he's exploring that, and if that were true, if there's absolutely no organized matter energy which is not radically dependent for its very identity upon human consciousness, then there isn't really anything for God to create. So personally, I don't think there is a rational route to God, and I think he sees that there isn't. So that's sort of at the point where I think we need to explore and say, well, is he getting that wrong? Is he getting that sort of radical existentialism? Is he taking existentialism too far? You know, even if we do accept that he's established it as a very helpful tool for modern thought and inspiring modern people, but maybe he's taking it too far.
I think part of the challenge with him too is that he's like a bit of a journey, such that he might be warming up to God, and he's certainly having conversations. You had mentioned the Word on Fire writers that he had met with. He's also met with Bishop Barron a few times, I think, and I found that conversation quite interesting, because it seemed that Barron had dialed in very acutely to some of the things that he could perceive in Peterson's thought, where he was getting stuck. And he was sort of filling in those gaps as how you can get all the way to a transcendent God, and that there is a richness within this intellectual tradition where you don't have to abandon your mind at the door when you walk into a church. And so I wonder if Peterson's own thought has maybe evolved or developed beyond where it had been at certain intervals that we would be very obvious and explicit to us, such as like when he wrote his book, 12 Rules for Life, or when he did those lectures, or more recently when he started publishing again. Do you get the sense that it has developed at all, or do you think that he's been fairly consistent along the way?
Yeah, I think that there probably is some development. For instance, I notice he talks of embodiment more recently, which I think is going to be key if his thought is to move, I think, in a more rational and also a more Christian direction. So that's interesting. I'm not sure if I heard you correctly, but you know, if in his encounters with Bishop Barron, he's very good at listening, and he's quite humble, and I think he does want to learn, Jordan Peterson, as is Bishop Barron. But and so he does listen, but I wasn't convinced that he in any way moved towards theism at that point, or at any point, frankly, in his thought. And so sometimes people say, gosh, he's really about to become a Catholic or something like that, because why? Because he has said that Catholic thought is the most sanest of thoughts, partly because it takes the hero myth, if I've understood him correctly, again, he might correct me, but because it takes the hero myth and it makes it historical. And that is the most ultimate of hero myths. But of course, the historical for him, as he made clear to the Word on Fire people, is still fundamentally, creatively, and rooted in the human subjectivity. But still, to make it historical like that is the ultimate myth for him. And therefore, he sees there, and in Genesis, profound descriptions of the human psychology and yearning. But that's it. In the end, that's what those texts are. They are ultimate purely projections and not revelations from a transcendent God. And that's a significant difference.
Yes.
From the Catholic Christian tradition, which we need to flag up. I think not to sort of say, hey, he's nearly a Catholic. Yeah.
Right.
Well, in fact, that's not the case. He hasn't claimed it. He's just being reverent and respectful towards us, and he clearly is, particularly to Catholicism. But he can't get to the idea of a transcendent personal creator who reveals something new to us through the means of our Lord Jesus Christ and the Bible and the tradition. He can't. Why? Well, we're touching on that, but because he takes the existentialism too far. I think it's something to do with not taking embodiment seriously, actually, personally.
Okay. In anticipation of this meeting, I went back and reread a few portions of his book. And so maybe I'll take a first crack at trying to describe his understanding of what revelation is, what God is, what faith and myth are, in contrast to what it is that we believe about revelation and faith and the nature of God and our relation to him. And I was quite surprised actually to read how explicit he is in his book when he describes this. So he takes a very sort of almost like an H.G. Wells kind of historical trip, going all the way back to prehistory and describing what human beings would have been like in prehistory, and that they behaved a certain way. And that it was an inherent thing that they just did. They acted a certain way. They acted morally. They acted presumably in the way that they ought to act. And then at a certain point, they started recognizing the way that they were behaving, and they started codifying that and telling stories about it to inspire others and maybe successive generations. And that became sort of the mythology and the stories of basically any religion. I suppose you could use this account to describe the origins of all religions, and maybe that's one of the first problems with it. And then, of course, this evolves and it becomes more elaborate, and we get to something like God. We get to the notion of sacrifice as a remedy to this pattern of behavior where he says that we noticed something in our behavior, which is a very important detail, which is that if we delay gratification right now, we can achieve a greater good in the long run. And that this is the pattern of what he describes as work. This is the this is the essence of work, right? And so in that account, I mean, we have implied evolution. I think he actually even does invoke evolution into that sort of this progression of going from sort of this kind of crude culture with no stories and no sense of sacrifice, work, and obviously God and mythology, to a people who recognize the way that they're behaving and the benefits of some of the things that they're already doing, to telling stories about this pattern, to making sacrifices to those stories, to making sacrifices through work, and then that becoming sort of an elaborate cultural mode of worship, which, as you say, that from that narrative and from that view, all you could really say about God in the end, and our faith and our culture and the narratives and revelation in Scripture, is that it's just something that we have projected. It's just something that we have created. Without humanity, there would be no God, there would be no mythology, there would be no stories. And of course, as Catholics, we can't believe that. As you say, God, we have to get to a transcendent God, a God who is wholly other, a God who truly exists. So first of all, do I have that account right, would you say?
Yeah, I think so. If I could maybe add just one little point again. Earlier, just maybe to sort of move that story a tiny bit towards us. That is to say that Jordan Peterson does believe in objective morality, and I think in that story of this gradual awakening to the need to sacrifice, for instance, I think he does see that as the discovery gradually of an objective morality.
Okay.
So in that sense, I see him as, in that sense at least, as quite Kantian, quite like Immanuel Kant, who you may remember in his first main work, the Critique of Pure Reason. He ultimately did, at least in the popular understanding of it, he did seem to say, well, all intelligibility, all order, all patterns, Peter's big on discerning patterns within what we project or engage with. All of that is primarily us interpreting through the sunglasses we wear or the categories we wear. Yeah. And then in the Critique of Practical Reason, he said there is an objective morality, and from that Kant even got to God. And I think, fundamental for Kant, I think, was the imperative to, I mean, I'd be doing him an injustice if I tried to sort of get it, but it's like some basic thing like do as you would be done by, or, foster true community, etc. And that is something objective. And I think Peterson is exploring how that might even be being discovered through this evolution of the human person. But I did, last November he was in Cambridge University here in England, and he gave a fascinating talk there. But he said even evolution, he said, was a result of a conscious choice, so the evolution of life, I presume he's talking about there. He even there was held to his existentialism and a sort of view that everything is rooted in human, I think, conscious creativity. So he's still got that, but there is, I just wanted to balance it with the fact that he certainly does, as we know, and powerfully affirm objective morality.
Okay, that's interesting. Do you think that he would describe one of the problems I always get into with conversations, especially about ethics and morality, and I love to introduce that into these kinds of conversations because I find arguments from morality for the existence of God to be the most compelling to me, especially because it's something that we can all relate to. We all have an experience of the ethical impulse within us or imposed upon us from without. So it's something we all have experience of, whereas cosmological arguments and these kinds of things can be very abstract or just remote from our own experience sometimes. And I find that even if you get somebody all the way there with a cosmological argument, they'll go, yeah, okay, maybe, as an intellectual exercise, but I can't really relate to that, right? And so I find morality is a very compelling ingredient to introduce to these conversations. But what I find most people... where it becomes a struggle is in what people understand morality to be. Often I find what people consider to be morality is good behavior. They will identify. So if you say tell me what morality is, they'll say something like taking care of the poor or loving your neighbor as yourself. Okay, well those might be examples of moral behavior that you approve of, but that's not morality itself. Right? Morality is that approval of those things. It's the ability to deliberate about events and behaviors and acts of the will, and to then say about those events, this is what should have happened, this was good, and this is bad. And the only way we can do that is if there is some objective standard that sits out and above beyond our own judgments that we can compare those things to. So it's a judgment about these things. And I wonder, would you say that, first of all, do you agree with me about my definition of morality? And second of all, does Peterson align with that, would you say?
Yes. I think I'd give a sort of qualified yes on your first question and a strong yes on the second question. So I think you've articulated it well, as Jordan Peterson does as well, that there's surely an objective morality which somehow evaluates our goodness and badness from our own angle. But I suppose I think we need more than that, because our own experience of moral value is of behavior. And I think that's why people often sort of just fall back to that. It is of understanding the world in which we live, and there's various options for us to act well or to act badly, and we make that choice. And yes, there's a moral value there, but of course, to firm it up and indeed to make it Judeo-Christian as well, is to not allow intelligibility to be left out of that vision, to say that simultaneously with that moral argument, but rooting it properly, is the idea that this world, which in some sense we experience and maybe create, and which somehow mediates an evaluation of our acts, is itself from a person, is itself from an intelligence which is transcendent. So human morality is about intellect and will, and we want to move, I think, from that to the, and it's a very, very traditional idea that God is intellect and will. Now, that's not the God of the philosophers, the one that turns people off, because it's not going to be, I think, a cosmological argument, particularly in the light of Peterson. It's going to be an argument from human experience, using some of his phenomenology and existentialism and pragmatism and personalism to affirm that the intelligibility of the world in which we live as embodied people comes from an intelligence who is good. And so our conscience is an awareness, if you like, of that moral side, but our intellect should also be aware that this world in which we live is intelligible because it's come from an intelligence who therefore is inviting us to be good and to have a relationship with him. I think that's the fullness of the argument we're looking for. And it's not as dry as the old arguments that ended up with God as purely a first cause or a prime mover.
First mover,
He's not really the God of the Bible. It's not really the God of the Old Testament, who on every page is a person and an intelligence. And I don't know, you tell me, but I pray the Psalms and the Old Testament every day, and I've never seen first cause mentioned. Now, I don't know, maybe it's that. I've never seen prime mover.
The Thomists are smashing their keyboards right now. I know. We have to be careful.
I don't want to disrespect that fantastic tradition that did such massive service for the Aristotelian culture. But I just think we're in a new culture, and I believe that Thomas Aquinas would be saying maybe we need to do something similar to what I did for that culture, formed the High Renaissance very well, for a culture that is slightly more rooted in human experience and in which we have a new science. It's no longer the Aristotelian science, and that can somehow synthesize this new knowledge. And what I'm suggesting is, particularly in the light of Peterson, he's showing us we're going to be, if this works, this route, we're going to be arguing for a good, loving person immediately, not as further down the philosophical route after the argument from contingency or whatever, but immediately, in the light of our own experience of being embodied people. And I don't think people quite gets that.
Right. Yeah, and if I can try to reinforce what you're saying here a little bit too, because I can see people getting defensive about this, because what St. Thomas, and he's not alone in this is a tradition that goes all the way back to the patristics and probably to the apostles as well, was trying to do was to reconcile faith and reason, and to establish or maybe to fine-tune solutions to some of the fundamental questions, such as where does our knowledge based on reason end, and where does our knowledge based on faith begin, and how do they interact? What's the relationship between those two things? And in St. Thomas's day, as you say, Aristotle was sort of the new. He was sort of rediscovered, right? And so his thought was making waves in academia and in philosophy, and was introducing all kinds of compelling ways at looking at reality and inquiring into the world that we live in. And so that raised new new questions about how faith interacts with reason and how these two can be reconciled. If Aristotle is right in his thought about any number of things, well, truth can't contradict truth. So if there is truth in the deposit of our faith, then it must be reconcilable to the deposit of knowledge that comes to us through someone like Aristotle or Plato, for that matter, or any of the sort of the contemporary thinkers of St. Thomas's day who were making scientific discoveries, right? And so it's what St. Thomas is doing is looking at the contributions of an Aristotle, using his terminology, using his categories, using his thought, and saying, this is how we can use that thought to rationally get to God, and from there, revelation has to start taking over, and that throughout all of that, grace is perfecting that process. So as we employ our reason, God's grace is allowing us to avoid making certain mistakes and to use the thought that's out there that is sound and is good and is compatible with truth, and to avoid the deposit of thought that maybe doesn't get quite right. And so what I think you're saying is that, yes, okay, so that was great in St. Thomas's day, because Aristotle was there's sort of a revolution of thought taking place there. A lot has happened since then, and we need to find perhaps new ways that are effective in introducing people rationally to an encounter with God.
Yeah.
And then let revelation take over again from there in a way that makes sense for people.
Exactly. And I'd just preface it, developing on what you were saying there, with the fact that we just need to remember that, as we've been arguing all the way through this discussion, what we need particularly is belief in a transcendent personal God. I think another thing that we particularly need, and John Paul II in Fides et Ratio highlighted that as well, is a belief in human nature, which exists, and our Lord Jesus shares that and therefore can save us. And even John Paul II went a little bit further and said that we need really to affirm the strong, I think, authoritative tradition that we are physical body and spiritual soul. So they are the things we need. Now, exactly, I would say, personally, how we do that is not that as important as doing it in a way that tunes in to the modern culture and modern insights. And if, in the providence of God, someone like Jordan Peterson might be, he may not be, so, I'm not throwing all my eggs in his basket, but I think we need to, what we're doing here is investigate, is his thought, which is so popular, and John Paul II seemed to be into it, not totally, obviously, but in its roots, a way of showing that we have a spiritual soul and that God exists. And what I'd say is Thomas Aquinas did that fantastically for Aristotelian science. So he found a way of moving from the world that we observe around us through the senses to the metaphysical, which is going to be crucial in proving that we have a non-physical soul and that there's a transcendent God. We need to move to that which transcends the objects of the senses and the physical. And I think Thomas Aquinas realized that. He brilliantly defended body and soul. He brilliantly defended realism, I suppose that's another thing, for the Aristotelian analysis of things, which sometimes is called hylomorphism, the sort of form-matter distinction. He brilliantly defended the transcendent God. But as you've just said, we're in a different place now, where through modern science, we've realized that which organizes different things into one, which used to be called at the level of substances, like arsenic or something like that, or living things, plants and animals, used to be called the form, or the substantial form, is actually intrinsic to everything, whether it's at a lower level of physics, chemistry, biology, life sciences, cosmology. Everything through and through has properties which are relationships with their environment, and that therefore everything is both individual and formal, in the more technical language of medieval philosophy, particular and universal, and they are real. So we're going to be realist at the end of the day. Now, what the other thing that has happened, as well as modern science, is phenomenology. Is this move, that the post-Kantian move, to recognize that human minds are intrinsically involved with this. Now, And I don't think we should be scared of that. I think it's going to be a way to show that God is a mind who's intrinsically involved with the world as well. But we're not there yet. But that it's not something secondary to this hylomorphism, that you can somehow sort of define things out there and then add on a way of knowing, the knowing relationship, which was sometimes by abstraction within this medieval and later scholasticism, but actually is something intrinsic to the ontology of what things are. And that's very much a Peterson thought when he talks about a tree stump truly becoming a chair in the light of the human mind. And he's very good at that. And when he articulates very well with a gentleman called Jonathan Pageau, who's had some very interesting discussions with, that a cliff is first of all a falling off place, and secondarily it has a form. Secondarily, it is a sheer rock or something like that. So the description of something prescinding from the phenomenology, prescinding from the human subjectivity, for Peterson is secondary and derivative from the primary meaning of anything, and its existential and essential existence is primarily a capacity for human beings to act in our knowledge. That's a route that Peter said. We've got two things that have happened here. One in modern science, things are far more interlinked and hierarchical, a big word again for Jonathan Pageau and Jordan Peterson and others, and their discussion, and most philosophers of science as well. Things are interwoven across a hierarchy of physics, chemistry, biology. And on the other hand, we have the turn to the subject, which has revealed that you can't leave human subjectivity out of your ontology, out of your description of how things are. In fact, quite the opposite. Its meaningfulness has to be basic to our description of what exists.
Yeah, I want to return to this really quick, but before I do, I also want to digress really quickly here, because I can hear some people potentially reacting to what we're saying as if we're saying that Catholic thought, and even so far as Catholic doctrine and maybe even dogma, needs to be revised based on where we've moved, right? So we talked about, this sort of Aristotelian moment, and now we've moved on through various intellectual movements. What we're not saying, and at least I'm not saying this, and you can add your thoughts to this, is that Catholic thought, and especially Catholic teaching and revelation, needs to adjust to conform to human reason. Certainly, church teaching is the reverse of that. Is it philosophy is the handmaiden of theology? Is that how we describe it? Yeah. So we're certainly not saying that, but we're saying that in these spheres of knowledge, we have faith and we have reason, and within the sphere of reason, things are adjusting as we grow in our understanding, and as certainly the experimental sciences have added to that knowledge. We now need to perhaps adjust the way that we talk about certain concepts within that sphere, and also rhetorically, because at the end of the day, what is most important when we're having conversations with people like Jordan Peterson or any non-Christian is to try to invite them into an encounter and a relationship with Jesus Christ, right? So we need to be willing and able to participate in these kinds of conversations to help people to lead them towards that encounter. And if we just refuse to do so, and if we just say, oh, well, that's silly, I mean, that's just Kantianism, let's talk about Aristotle, and they're thinking, well, no, I think Kant had some points, right? You need to interact with these if you want me intellectually to start sympathizing with your theistic view. So am I right about that?
Yeah, you're right. I think you've answered that. Nice. I would agree with that, what you've just said.
Okay.
I think that all of us, as practicing Catholics who are living the sacramental life, we are convinced we're in a relationship with God through Jesus Christ, in and through the church by the Holy Spirit, and that is fundamental to our relationship with God, and that is revelation. But we believe that reason can found it, and John Paul II in Fides et Ratio in 1998 made it clear that there are sort of 3 or 4 or 5 things, and we mentioned the 2 key things, the transcendence of God and the spiritual soul, that are clearly crucial in our use of reason, and we must use reason, otherwise we're fideist, purely based on revelation. But our relationship with our Lord frees us to recognize the Spirit of truth is leading us into all truth, and that some of the lower level details of our use of reason can change. And so I think Cardinal Newman was asking for that. People like C.S. Lewis, I think, were asking for that. Even Christopher, the great Catholic historian Christopher Dawson. I think many theologians in the 20th century have been grappling with that. One of the most famous, I think, is probably Karl Rahner. Now, I might not agree again with some of his conclusions, but he was grappling. He was trying to use existentialism. Personally, I don't think he held to those 4 or 5 things that John Paul II has highlighted. So we just need to keep looking for our culture. If we're going to re-evangelize culture, culture is a network of ideas, and the use of modern knowledge that is good, we just need to be open to that. But we do need to be careful, and not least in the use of existentialism, which has been used to undermine our faith in so many ways. And indeed, in the hands of Jordan Peterson, as well as doing many positive things, intellectually at least, is also doing some negative things.
Mm-hmm. So we've been orbiting around a lot of these concepts like pragmatism and existentialism and phenomenology and such, and those are useful for those who can do a bit of a deep dive or have some familiarity with those concepts, and you've been doing a pretty good job of introducing us to what those mean and the implications of them. But and as much as Peterson might be familiar with those things, what I like about him, and maybe this is something that we can learn at least rhetorically, if not intellectually, from him, is that I don't really hear him drawing from those isms so much in the way that he introduces concepts. Instead, he'll say something like, is a tree stump or is it a chair? Right? He'll take us through these intellectual exercises rather than saying, well, the existentialists would say this.
Yeah.
And so what I'm curious to hear from you is, what would you say to the question, is that a tree stump or is that a chair? What should we as Catholics, how should we respond to that question?
Yeah. So what I would say is that if a community makes a tree stump into an important chair, even, well, perhaps without doing much to the tree stump even, then for that community, maybe sounding relativist for a moment, for that community, it is real. And indeed, the noun chair will appear in its sentences like nouns for tree stumps do as well. So it will be quite similar to what a tree stump is. It's now a unity with an environmental function, which is actually what science shows everything is, really. However, the source of making that tree stump into a chair is the human mind, the human creativity that Jordan Peterson articulates quite well. What I think he misses is that in our bodily engagement with things like tree stumps, it's a deterministic thing. It's not based upon human will. It is a similar interaction. It's still interacting with unities that are made of parts that have functions across a hierarchy that are meaningful to us, but it is deterministic. And that creates a way of relating that's not purely rooted in the human subject. It's rooted in the physical thing itself, which is my body and the tree stump deterministically. And as we investigate it, we find that it's actually rooted across this hierarchy of the physical cosmos that we discover. So whilst if we find that a tree stump's been made into a chair, we can see that that's not rooted in the natural hierarchy. So we call it an artifact. And if we find one in a forest, we would recognize, particularly if we engage with its functionality, that there's an invitation from another human person there to engage with it and to make use of it. Whereas
and to define it even.
that's not the case of the tree stump and its place within the whole ecosystem across the
Yeah.
planet Earth and across actually the whole cosmos, which, though it is a similar organized unity with potentials for me to act and is very helpful to me and has a moral value and seems to be an invitation to me to engage with it constructively, it exists also, but in an even more real way, in a sense, relative to a bigger inviter, a bigger subject, a bigger creative subject who transcends determinism, the determinism of the whole cosmos. And that's the sort of route I think that we should be taking. Jordan Peterson is just to remind him that there is within the human subjectivity a way of relating that is not based on human will. It is the human body, which is based on deterministic natures relating with its environment. We can use, we use the body to make the tree stump into a chair, but that is a spiritual power. It's a creative use of the will. But within matter, and so we know from our bodily interaction and from modern science, which has confirmed it massively, that at the very least at the normal human level of interacting with things, it's predictable, it's usable according to deterministic, unfree, non-willed natures. So whereas the chair, finds its meaning purely in a human will, the tree finds its meaning across the ecosystem and across the whole cosmos, and ultimately in an ultimate will.
I like the way that you're tying this to meaning specifically, rather than like what is the composition of matter of this thing that we're looking at. Yeah. Rather, like what does this thing mean to us?
Exactly.
And if that's a valid question, it can only be valid based on the assumption that some meaning is being communicated through this sort of neutral environment and its various artifacts, right? And if something is being communicated that is meaningful, that on the other end of that transaction, that sort of process of communication, there must be a person.
That's ultimately it. That's ultimately it. And something is being communicated by my environment. Yeah. The whole of my physical environment in which I live in the present moment. Something is, and that is that I can act in various ways for good or for bad. Sometimes that's communicated by you, moving your hands and speaking to me. That's another human being. And I can see that the movement of your hands is not purely what is natural to your purely physical body and is not purely fitting in to the hierarchy of natural potentials and unities across the whole environment. And therefore, I can say that is another subject. That is a human being. Peterson and people assume there are other subjects, but they don't really show where they get that assumption from, apart from it's one of those things, again, that pretty difficult to deny. But this says, I can see there's a subject in your language to me. Similarly, I should be able to see that there's a subject in the interactions and the deeply patterned, interwoven relationships of the purely physical universe, in as much as it does not speak to me of an individual human subject, but still it is patterned and ordered and giving me a moral value, and it transcends all human subjects because it's actually the context in which I discern other subjects. I couldn't really know you were another human subject like me if it wasn't for the fact that there's a physical, deterministic, very smoothly patterned through physics, chemistry, and biology, and I think probably evolution as well, which contextualizes your movement as something that doesn't fit into that. Rather like my own creation of a chair out of a tree stump. Right. And therefore, that context, which goes beyond all human subjects, needs another transcendent subject, namely the God who is spoken about on every page of the Old Testament.
Yeah, because I would say, and I think you would probably agree with me, but I'll let you say so if that's the case, that if either of us, or anybody for that matter, were to be stranded on a deserted island and to never have any other interaction with another human being, I would be hard-pressed to be convinced that that would still be a meaningless life, that there's still meaning to be had within that life. And the only way that we can, again, agree with that sentiment is if that meaning is being communicated through the environment, not by just the environment itself, because the environment doesn't have an intellect or a will, but that it is mediating and communicating that meaning from somewhere else, and it has to be from an intellect and a will, which could only be God.
I think so. And as you touched on earlier, when we were discussing the extra reading you've done recently, that Peterson, I think, is sort of saying, well, yeah, it is all created by me, the desert island. However, in my interaction with it, I discern a morality beyond it. What I'm saying is we can complete this circle much better by saying, look, Jordan, you have that creativity in your recognition of potentials beyond natural potentials, in pushing beyond limits, in looking to the ultimate. Ultimately, yes, you're right, and that's a creative thing. And if you make a little cup to drink water out of the stream on the desert island, well, you are being godlike when you do that. And if you find another cup, hey, presto, you're not alone, sort of thing. But you're a body as well. You're a body which is part of your subjectivity and is in a meaningful, sensitive, but deterministic relationship with the desert island. And that is speaking of something bigger than human subjectivity. It's speaking of divine subjectivity, which is moral, certainly, which is an invitation to be good. The world is, and that even a desert island is a stage and an invitation for the human person to say yes to God.
So within those who have sympathies to some notion of God, and I would put Peterson under that big umbrella, it seems to me that there's a couple ways you can go with this, and there might be more, but there's two that I want to identify, which is perhaps the view that Peterson has, which is that a lot of this just arises out of our own necessity to be able to tell stories and to find something that works for us, either psychologically or otherwise. And a belief in God and mythology and stories and ritual sacrifice and these kinds of things, these have a very calming and productive effect on the human mind and soul, perhaps you would say. But that they don't necessarily communicate anything about something external to us, or something, if we're talking about God, something that is transcendent to us, right? Whereas there's the other view, and I would say this is the Catholic view, which is that there actually is something external and transcendent which we are interacting with. And I would want to highlight two things from our own tradition. One is Pope St. Pius X's encyclical, which is Pascendi Dominici Egregius, which is the encyclical he wrote about modernism. And he talks about this concept, I think he called it vital immanence, which is basically just that. It's this notion that there isn't really anything external. There's no external God. There's no transcendent God who is revealing truth to us, what we would call revelation. Rather, this is something that arises from our own subjectivity, and that this he condemns and he anathematizes as a sort of an essential ingredient within modernism, and is not a view we can have about God. Now, I don't know if Peterson would actually agree that that's what he thinks about God, but if so, I mean that's a very explicit incompatibility with the Catholic view. And the other thing I would want to highlight is what comes from Scripture, specifically in the book of Exodus, in which Moses first encounters this transcendent God, who, when he asks, "Who are you?" what's the first thing in his revelation of who he is that he says about himself? It's not, "I'm a figment of your imagination. I'm not this necessary evolutionary need you have for stories and myth." It is, "I am. I exist. I am the ground of all being, and everything is contingent upon me, even you, not the other way around." And I think that is something that we need to wrestle with, and we need to make sure that we as Catholics appreciate, because one turns into adoration and worship, whereas the other, I think, can very easily, if not necessarily, become idolatry.
Yeah. And that revelation, I am, is the revelation of an absolute being that everything's dependent. But it's also the revelation of an absolute person, because it's I.
It's I am. Yeah. Yes.
And so it's phenomenological, and really we can say, I am in an environment. And I don't think anyone could deny that without going mad. I exist
Right. Right.
in a world that is bigger than me, that I must engage with.
Yeah.
So it is there right at the beginning. I think Peterson sometimes does talk as if as I say, he I think, assumes, as many persons do, that other subjects are just self-evident somehow, which is interesting. But it's as if you and I right now are sort of improvising actors who have been given a story and we're engaging with it. And this computer and the things around me are part of what we posit gradually in our journey and in the human journey. And it is all dependent upon us. And we discover a morality within it, which is where he would move back towards Pius X. I think he wouldn't be a pure relativist, because he does have that. But still, it's not intelligibly that way. And I would say that really the reality is, of course, that we are more like Truman. I don't know, in The Truman Show, the film The Truman Show, and here's a spoiler alert if you haven't seen it. But it's a show where the guy's in a TV program and he doesn't realize it. Right. Even his best friend are actors. And yet his spirit transcends beyond that. And he's always searching the limits. He's always pushing his ecological niche, if you like. He's not satisfied by that. He's always looking at potentials here, and they're trying to, without him discovering that he's in a TV show, stop him going beyond the limits. And eventually he finds the one door in the last scene, because he wanted truth. He's Truman. He searched for truth. So that's, the human spirit is always looking beyond determinism and the natural hierarchy. And that is evidence that we're not purely matter energy. Have a non-physical spiritual soul. It's a development of the traditional proof. The traditional proof said we have abstract knowledge. I don't think that it's one of those things that needs updating and has been undermined, I would say, not just by showing that animals seem to have abstract knowledge, but actually by showing that universal, and this is getting technical now, but abstract things and particular things are actually interwoven within the concrete dynamic of matter energy. But it's a development of that, to say that humans go beyond limits, and nothing in nature does that. Everything in nature is defined by its local niche and ecosystem.
Right, and it finds fulfillment of its nature.
It finds
in
fulfillment
all those things.
in that. The seven things every animal does is what it, but we're not fulfilled by matter.
No.
And that's that's the opening to metaphysics.
Yeah.
That gets beyond the empirical. Is to recognize that. But you first got to have the empirical deterministic embodiment to see that. And I think it's that bit that Peterson missed. If you like, the materialists miss the opposite bit. They miss the whole thing that Peterson has been articulating.
Right.
We are creative people looking beyond limits, looking for the ultimate hero, if you like. And the materialists miss that and just reduce the human subjectivity to matter. But Peterson, by starting with that, reminds us that you can't do that, because all of matter can only be understood relevant to human subjectivity. But what he misses is the opposite, that human subjectivity can only be understood as embodied as well.
Just returning to this thought on fulfillment. I think Lewis said this really well, and I'm going to clumsily paraphrase him, but he said something like, if I find in myself a need or a desire for fulfillment that nothing in this world can satisfy, then it's reasonable to conclude that I was made for another world. That is, that I find my fulfillment in something that transcends this material experience, or at least merely material experience.
Yeah, I think that, but the reason why it's reasonable is that our bodies don't do that, and nothing in our physical environment does that. Our bodies are always related deterministically and within specific limits with our environment, and that by a sort of extrapolation is true of everything. Otherwise, science wouldn't work at all. We certainly couldn't build mobile phones, and really our engagement with the physical world couldn't work. So it's in the light of that point is true, that
Well,
our yearning beyond is metaphysical.
right. Yeah, and that pattern of technological development too. The reason we create technology like a cell phone, which is nothing like anything that is just found in the natural world, seems to speak to our desire and our need to transcend these
Yeah,
limits.
good point. It
Yeah.
does. You look at a mobile phone and you recognize that does not fit within the natural physical hierarchy, and therefore
Yeah.
it's a sign of a creative subject, because it has a real, intelligible, meaningful unity and purpose. But that's rooted in a human mind. Now the whole universe has a real unity and purpose for me, because it's my environment right now. And and that unity and purpose has a moral dimension. And therefore it is equally reasonable to say that it is an invitation from a transcendent, purely spiritual knower and lover, in whose image we are made, particularly in our souls, as the old catechism used to say.
Right. Well, Father Hugh, this has been a really beautiful and engaging conversation, and very illuminating for me, at least. And so thank you for being willing to sit down with me. For those who are watching, where can they learn more about the work that you're doing?
Yeah, well, the School of Thought, in which I'm most involved, has a website called faith.org.uk, and one of my emails is hugh.mackenzie1@outlook.com.
Okay. So if people want to promote their businesses or just spam you, that's the way to get a hold of Father Hugh. All right. Well, thank you again.
Don't be offended if I block you. Okay.
Absolutely. Yeah. There you go. I won't be giving out my email for that same reason. But thank you, Father Hugh. This has been a lot of fun.
Thank you very much.
Okay.
Cheers.
Thanks for watching. The reason I can continue making content like this is because of the generous support of my viewers. If you feel called to support this work, then consider joining the Reinforcements, which is my online community. There are multiple tiers, including free access for those who can't help financially but still want to join. You can join up at www.brianholdsworth.ca. Certain levels will also get a free gift basket from Glory and Shine, who is a family-owned Catholic bath and body products company whose beard balm I'm wearing right now. It's like aromatherapy for your face. Even if you don't join, they make amazing products, so check them out at gloryandshine.com. And don't forget to like and subscribe. You don't have to agree with everything I said to get value out of these kinds of conversations, so be sure to subscribe to be edified or challenged. There's value in both.